The night Keanu walked away, the rain fell quietly over Los Angeles, washing the streets in silver light. It was past midnight, and the city had begun to empty itself of sound. The air carried the smell of wet asphalt and the soft hum of passing cars. Somewhere near the edge of downtown, inside a quiet film studio, Keanu Reeves stood under a flickering streetlight, his coat damp, his eyes distant. He had just finished shooting what could have been one of his biggest films in years. Everyone celebrated inside, laughter, clinking glasses, congratulations all around. But Keanu had slipped out without a word. No one noticed except one person, Sandra Bullock. She saw the way he looked before leaving, that silent heaviness in his expression that only someone who truly knew him could understand. For years, she had worked beside him, shared screens, stories, quiet moments of realness behind all the fame. And tonight, something inside her said she couldn't just let him walk away, so she followed. The night was quiet when she stepped outside, holding her small umbrella. She saw his tall figure a little ahead, walking slowly toward the far end of the street, his head slightly down. She called out once, but her voice drowned under the rain. He didn't turn. Maybe he didn't want to. Maybe he couldn't. Sandra hesitated. She could go back, pretend she didn't see him, pretend everything was fine. But her heart wouldn't let her. She started walking faster. As she reached him, Keanu stopped. He didn't look at her right away. His eyes stayed on the empty road ahead. "You didn't have to come," he said quietly. "And yet I did," Sandra replied. "Because you looked like someone who didn't want to be found." Keanu gave a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe I didn't." The silence stretched between them. The rain fell harder. Sandra's umbrella wasn't big enough for both, but she tilted it anyway, letting her shoulder get wet. "You're leaving again, aren't you?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Sometimes walking away is the only thing that makes sense." "From what?" He turned finally, his face lit faintly by the streetlight. "From noise. From faces that don't mean what they say. From people who clap louder when you fall than when you rise." Her heart tightened at his words. She had seen this side of him before, the man who gave so much, asked for so little, and carried every scar in silence. "But you're not one of them," he added quietly. "That's why I didn't want you to see me like this." She looked at him with a softness that only truth brings. "You don't have to hide when you're tired, Keanu. Not from me." The words seemed to settle deep inside him. The rain softened for a moment, like the world was listening. He sighed and looked up at the dark sky. "I just needed to breathe, Sandra. Every day feels like a show. People love the idea of kindness, but they don't understand the weight of living it." She stayed silent. She knew this wasn't about fame. It was about the exhaustion that came when your heart wanted to do good in a world that often didn't care. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Then let's walk." He frowned slightly. "Walk where?" "Anywhere. As long as it's away from the noise you're running from." For the first time that night, he smiled genuinely. So they walked, side by side, through empty streets and quiet corners. No fans, no cameras, no lights, just two souls trying to remember what peace felt like. After a while, they reached a small diner still open, its neon sign flickering weakly. They went in, dripping wet, their clothes sticking to their skin. The old man behind the counter didn't recognize them. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't care. He handed them 2 mugs of coffee without asking questions. Sandra wrapped her hands around the warm cup and watched Keanu stare out the window. "You know," she said, "you have this way of disappearing whenever the world gets too loud." "It's not disappearing," he said. "It's surviving." "Then maybe you shouldn't do it alone." He looked at her, a small shadow of gratitude in his eyes. "You always say the right things." "Not always," she replied. But tonight felt like the right time to say something. The rain outside began to fade into mist. The city grew quiet again. Somewhere deep inside, Keanu felt something he hadn't felt in a while. Stillness. As they sat there, he finally spoke again. "You ever feel like kindness is heavy? Like it hurts to keep being gentle when the world keeps taking pieces of you?" She nodded slowly. "Every day. But maybe that's the point. Maybe kindness isn't about staying strong. Maybe it's about staying soft even when it hurts. He looked at her for a long time, then smiled faintly. You sound like someone who's been carrying that truth for too long, she smiled back. We all carry something, don't we? The old man behind the counter began turning off lights. It was nearly dawn. The first light of morning slipped through the window, pale and hopeful. Keanu looked at it and whispered almost to himself, Maybe I'll stay a little longer. Sandra smiled. I was hoping you would. He turned to her. Thank you. For what? For following without a word. She looked down at her coffee, then back at him. Some silences are worth breaking, and some are worth keeping. Outside, the rain stopped. The street shone with reflections of the new day. Keanu stood and offered his hand. She took it without hesitation. As they stepped back into the cool morning air, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was healing. And for the first time in a long time, Keanu didn't feel like he was walking away. He felt like he was walking toward something real. The morning after the silence, the sun had barely risen when Keanu and Sandra reached the small park near Sunset Boulevard. The world was still half asleep, wrapped in the gentle light of early morning. Dew shimmered on the grass, and the sound of distant birds filled the quiet air. Keanu sat on a wooden bench, hands clasped together, staring at the stillness before him. Sandra stood nearby, arms crossed, breathing slowly. Neither spoke for a long while. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the kind that heals, the kind that allows everything heavy to settle softly. You didn't sleep, Sandra finally said, her voice calm but laced with concern. Keanu shook his head. I don't remember the last time I really did. Too much noise in your head? More like too many ghosts, he replied, eyes still on the horizon. You try to move forward, but sometimes memories don't let you. She sat beside him quietly. The ones that hurt most are usually tied to kindness. He glanced at her. You think kindness can hurt? I know it can, she said softly. You give pieces of yourself to everyone, strangers, fans, people who never thank you. And one day, you realize you've given away so much, there's barely anything left for yourself. He nodded slowly. You sound like you've been there too. Maybe we all have, she whispered. But we just pretend better. The wind brushed past them gently. A jogger ran by with headphones on, not noticing who they were. Keanu looked at him, then smiled faintly. I envy that. The freedom of being unknown again. You're not the only one, Sandra replied, her voice carrying a soft sadness. But maybe being known isn't the problem. Maybe it's being misunderstood. He turned to her, eyes curious. You think that's what's happening to me? She smiled faintly. No. I think that's what's happening to your heart. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked down, tracing a small crack on the wooden bench with his finger. You know, when I walked out last night, I wasn't planning to come back. Her heart sank a little. To the studio? To any of it, he said quietly. To the cameras, the scripts, the noise. I thought maybe I'd disappear somewhere quiet, start over, be someone nobody recognizes. And yet, she said gently, you're still here. He smiled slightly. Because someone followed, Sandra's eyes softened. Sometimes following isn't about catching up. It's about reminding someone they don't have to walk alone. His eyes met hers. There was gratitude there, but also something deeper, something unspoken, fragile. After a long pause, she said, Come on, let's get breakfast. You look like you haven't eaten since yesterday. He laughed quietly. You sound like my mother. Good, she said, standing up. Then listen to me for once. They walked down the street to a small family cafe tucked between old buildings. The smell of fresh bread and coffee greeted them as they entered. A young waitress smiled warmly, showing no sign of recognition, or maybe she just chose not to react. They sat by the window. Sunlight spilled across their table, catching the faint tiredness in Keanu's eyes. You ever wonder, he said, why the simplest moments feel the most real? Because there's no pretending in them, Sandra replied. No cameras, no lines to remember. Just life as it should be, he nodded slowly. I miss that. The quiet mornings. The people who see you for who you are, not what you've... He nodded slowly. I miss that. The quiet mornings. The people who see you for who you are, not what you've done. She looked at him closely. Maybe you can have that again. But you have to stop running from it. I'm not running, he said quietly. I'm just lost. Then let's find you, she said. Together. The waitress brought their food, eggs, toast, and steaming mugs of coffee. Keanu took a sip, staring out the window again. Across the street, a young boy was helping his grandmother carry groceries up a steep step. She stumbled a little, and without thinking, Keanu stood up, went outside, and rushed to help. Sandra watched through the glass as he lifted the bags from the old woman's hands and smiled gently at her. She couldn't hear what he said, but she saw the gratitude in the woman's face. It was such a small thing, so natural, so quiet, yet it said everything about who he was. When he returned, Sandra shook her head with a faint smile. You can't help yourself, can you? He laughed softly. Maybe kindness is the only thing that keeps me from falling apart. Or maybe, she said, it's what holds you together. He paused, her words sinking in. Then he said something she didn't expect. You know what hurts most? What? The more you try to stay good, the more the world tests you. Sandra looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. And the more it needs you. His eyes lingered on her face for a long time. Something about her tone, the quiet conviction, the honesty, reminded him why he had always trusted her. You really believe that? He asked. I have to, she said, because if people like you stop believing, then kindness loses its meaning. He smiled gently, the corners of his eyes softening. You always say things that sound simple but feel like truth. Because truth doesn't need decoration, she replied. They finished breakfast, and for the first time in weeks, Keanu felt something loosen in his chest. It wasn't peace yet, but it was close. Outside, the sky had turned bright blue. People walked by laughing, carrying coffee, heading to work. Life moved on, and so did they. As they walked together toward the car, Sandra said quietly, So what now? He looked at her and thought for a moment. I think I'll take a drive. Somewhere quiet, alone, she asked. He hesitated. Would you come? She smiled softly. You didn't have to ask. They drove out of the city, windows down, wind rushing through their hair. The hills stretched endlessly ahead, golden and open. For a while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. It was enough to just be there, breathing the same air, chasing a silence that felt like peace. And yet, beneath the quiet, something else was growing. A question neither dared to ask, and a truth neither could yet name. The drive that changed everything, the road curved gently through the hills, winding like a quiet thought. The air was clear, the kind that smells of dust, grass, and freedom. Keanu kept one hand on the steering wheel, his gaze steady on the open road ahead. Sandra leaned her head against the window, watching the sun flicker through the trees. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty. It carried peace, like both were afraid to break something fragile. The sound of the tires on gravel became their rhythm, the hum of the engine their song. Finally, Sandra broke the quiet. You always drive like the world's not chasing you. Keanu smiled faintly. That's because for once it isn't. You really believe that? Not really, he said with a soft laugh. But sometimes pretending is the only way to breathe. She turned to look at him. You've been pretending for too long, haven't you? He didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the road. Since before the world knew my name. The honesty in his voice made her heart ache. She knew what he meant. The quiet pain that comes from being seen by everyone, but understood by no one. They drove for another hour until they reached a small lake hidden deep between the hills. The water was still, mirroring the wide sky above. Keanu parked the car under a tall oak tree. He stepped out, stretched his arms, and breathed deeply, as if the air itself could heal something inside him. This place, he said softly, was where I used to come when I needed to remember who I was. Sandra followed him to the water's edge. How long has it been since you were here? Years, he replied. Back then it was quiet. No cameras, no one asking for anything. Just me and the sound of wind. She knelt down and touched the cool water. It's still quiet, he smiled faintly. Not quiet enough. They sat on a fallen log near the shore. The sun was climbing higher now, scattering golden light across the lake. Keanu stared at the ripples, lost in thought. You know, he began, people think I walk away because I'm distant, but that's not true. I walk away because sometimes I care too much. Sandra looked at him gently. What do you mean? When you care, he said, you start carrying everyone's pain. Every story, every face, every stranger who says, thank you, with tears in their eyes. It all stays with you. And after a while, you forget what your own heart sounds like. She nodded slowly. You've been carrying too much for too long. Maybe, he said softly. But it's hard to stop. Kindness feels like breathing, even when it hurts. There was silence again, filled only by the soft lapping of the water. Sandra turned to him. You know, I've seen a lot of people pretend to be kind for the camera, but you're the only one who doesn't even realize when he's being kind. He smiled slightly, his eyes meeting hers. And you're the only one who keeps reminding me it matters. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two old friends who had seen the best and worst of the world and somehow still believed in goodness. Then, without warning, the peace was interrupted. From across the lake, they heard shouting. Keanu stood up instantly, scanning the far side. A man was waving frantically near the water, and beside him, a young girl was struggling, her arms flailing, head barely above the surface. Keanu didn't hesitate. Before Sandra could even speak, he was running, shoes pounding against the grass, jacket flying behind him. He reached the edge, kicked off his shoes, and dove straight into the cold water. Sandra's heart raced as she ran after him, shouting, Keanu! The man on the other side was crying, My daughter! Please help! Keanu swam hard, his strokes powerful but calm. He reached the girl just as she slipped under. He caught her arm, pulling her up, gasping as she coughed and cried. It's okay, he said softly. I've got you. You're safe now. With slow, steady effort, he brought her to the shore. Sandra and the father rushed to help, pulling them both out. Keanu sat back on the grass, drenched, breathing heavily. The father hugged his daughter tightly, tears streaming down his face. Thank you, the man whispered again and again. You saved her. You saved her life. Keanu just nodded quietly, his chest still heaving. Just glad she's okay? Sandra knelt beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder. You didn't even think, she said softly. You just moved. He looked up at her, water dripping from his hair, eyes tired but gentle. That's what kindness is, isn't it? Doing something before you think about yourself. The father approached them again, trembling. Sir, I don't even know how to thank you. Keanu shook his head. You don't have to. Just take care of her. The man nodded, speechless. Sandra watched Keanu closely, the way he smiled at the child, the calm in his face despite the chaos. She knew this wasn't just another act of kindness. This was who he truly was, beneath all the fame and silence. When they finally got back to the car, Keanu changed into a dry shirt from the back seat. Sandra handed him a towel and said quietly, You know, most people would call that fate. He smiled softly. Or maybe the world was just reminding me why I shouldn't walk away. She nodded. You always find your reason, don't you? No, he said, looking out at the lake again. Sometimes it finds me. The sun was setting now, painting the water in gold. They sat on the hood of the car, watching the sky fade into evening. Neither spoke for a while. Then Sandra said quietly, You realize that little girl will grow up telling the world Keanu Reeves saved her life. He laughed lightly. I'd rather she just remember that someone cared. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of lake water and pine. Sandra turned to him, eyes thoughtful. You say you want to disappear, but you keep leaving light wherever you go. He smiled faintly. Maybe I'm not meant to disappear after all. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. No, Keanu, you're meant to be found. The stars began to appear above the fading light. For the first time in a long while, Keanu didn't feel lost. He felt seen. The next morning came softly, wrapped in pale light that spilled through the motel curtains. Keanu woke early, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands. Outside, the world was quiet again. The kind of silence that feels alive, like it's waiting for something to happen. Sandra was still asleep on the couch beside the window, wrapped in a blanket. Her hair was messy, her breathing steady. Keanu watched her for a moment, a small, peaceful smile on his face. She looked calm, far from the chaos of lights, cameras, and endless noise they both had known for so long. He looked away, his gaze wandering toward the mountains beyond the road. He had always loved mornings like this and the moments before the world woke up, before people began pretending again. But deep inside, something unsettled him. He couldn't shake the thought of last night. The little girl he had saved, the man's tears, the gratitude in their eyes. It had been so sudden, so real, and it reminded him of everything he tried to forget, the reason he kept walking away from the spotlight. Sandra stirred awake. She rubbed her eyes and smiled faintly. "You've been up long." "A while," he said softly. "Couldn't sleep. Still thinking about the lake?" "A little," he admitted. "And about everything else." She stretched and walked over to him, sitting on the arm of the chair. "You did something incredible yesterday." He shook his head slowly. "I did what anyone should do." "Not everyone would," she replied. "You always say that kindness hurts, but yesterday it healed someone. Maybe even you." He smiled weakly. "You make it sound easy." "It's not," she said. "But it's simple. There's a difference." He looked at her quietly for a moment. "You ever get tired of being the one who reminds others what good looks like?" "All the time," she said with a small laugh. "But then I remember there are people who still listen." His gaze softened. "Thank you for following me that night." "You don't have to thank me. I do," he said quietly. "If you hadn't, I'd still be walking alone." She smiled gently. "You never really walk alone, Keanu. You just forget to look beside you." He didn't respond, but her words stayed with him like sunlight that refuses to fade. Later that day, they packed up and drove again, not toward the city but further into the quiet. They found a small town near the edge of the forest where no one recognized them. The locals smiled, waved, and went about their simple lives. There was peace there. Not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from belonging. They rented a small cabin beside a stream. The air was crisp, filled with the smell of pine and earth. Keanu felt something loosen inside him, as if the weight he'd been carrying was finally lifting. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire talking about life, work, and all the things they had lost and found over the years. Sandra told stories about her childhood, about the times she failed, the people who doubted her, the quiet moments that shaped her. Keanu listened, truly listened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt understood. One evening, while Sandra was out walking by the stream, Keanu found an old envelope tucked inside his backpack. It was worn, yellowed at the edges, with a single name written on it: Sandra. He froze. He remembered writing it years ago, one night after a long shoot they had done together. It wasn't a love letter, not exactly. It was a letter of truth, words he had never spoken aloud. He opened it slowly. The paper crackled softly. His handwriting was neat, careful. Dear Sandra, there are moments when I don't understand why our paths keep crossing, but every time they do, something in me finds peace. You remind me that being kind doesn't have to mean being perfect. You make silence feel safe. If I ever disappear, I hope you know that it's not because I stopped caring. It's because I care too much. Maybe one day I'll have the courage to give you this. He stared at the letter for a long time. Years had passed, yet the words felt alive, honest. Sandra returned, her hair damp from the mist, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hey," she said softly. "What's that?" He hesitated, then handed it to her. "Something I wrote a long time ago. I never meant for you to read it." She looked at him, curious but gentle. "And now I think maybe you should." She opened the letter, her eyes moving slowly across each line. When she finished, she folded it carefully, holding it close to her chest. "You never gave yourself enough credit, you know," she whispered. "You make people feel seen, even when you're trying to disappear." He looked away, his voice low. Maybe I was afraid you'd think it was too much, she smiled softly. It's not too much. It's real. And maybe that's what the world needs most. They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the stream filling the air. Sandra reached out and placed her hand over his. He didn't pull away. Their fingers stayed entwined, not in romance, but in understanding, in something deeper. The firelight danced across their faces, warm and golden. Keanu looked at her and said quietly, "You've always been the one person who saw past everything." She smiled faintly. "And you've always been the one person who made me want to." Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees. The night grew colder, but inside the cabin, the warmth felt almost sacred. Two souls who had carried too much, finally finding a place to rest. Later that night, after Sandra had fallen asleep, Keanu stepped outside. The stars spread endlessly across the sky, bright and patient. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Maybe I wasn't meant to walk alone after all." The sound of the stream answered softly, like the world agreeing. The moment everything changed, the next morning began with soft sunlight slipping through the cracks of the cabin window. Birds sang faintly in the distance, and the smell of pine and dew filled the air. Sandra stood by the small kitchen stove, quietly making coffee. The sound of the percolating pot was the only thing breaking the stillness. Keanu sat at the small wooden table, sketching absent-mindedly on a napkin. He wasn't an artist, not really. He just liked drawing shapes when his mind felt too heavy. Today, though, his lines looked softer, lighter. Sandra turned and placed a cup in front of him. "You draw like someone trying to remember something," she said with a gentle smile. "Maybe I am," he replied. "Maybe I'm trying to remember what peace looks like." She sat down across from him, her eyes calm and bright. "Then I think you've already found it." He looked at her, quiet for a moment. "You ever think about how strange it is? The way life brings certain people back, right when you need them?" "Maybe it's not strange," she said. "Maybe it's grace." He smiled faintly. "Grace? Yeah, that sounds about right." For a long time, they just sat there, sipping coffee and letting silence speak. It wasn't awkward anymore. It was soft, comfortable, like two people who no longer needed to fill the air with words. But somewhere in the distance, fate was preparing a test neither of them saw coming. Around noon, Sandra suggested they drive into town. "We've been hiding long enough," she said lightly. "Let's get some groceries before we start living off instant noodles." Keanu laughed. "Fine, but I'm not carrying another 20 bags. You know how this ends?" "You'll carry them anyway," she teased. "You always do." The drive into town felt easy. The kind of drive where windows are down, music is soft, and the world feels kind. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him about a film she wanted to make, a story about quiet heroes, about people who do good when no one's watching. Keanu listened closely, his expression thoughtful. "That sounds beautiful," he said. "You should make it," she smiled. "Only if you promise to play the lead." "Me?" he chuckled. "I think the world's had enough of me on screens." "Not like this," she said. "Not the actor, the man. The one who still believes kindness is worth the pain." He didn't reply right away, but she could tell her words had reached him. They reached town and parked near a small market. The streets were quiet, lined with old shops and flower stalls. It was peaceful, until chaos broke the calm. From down the street came the screech of tires, followed by a loud crash. People screamed. A small truck had swerved off the road, hitting a pole. Smoke rose from under its hood. Keanu and Sandra ran instantly toward it. An older woman stood nearby, panicked, shouting, "My husband! He's inside!" Keanu didn't hesitate. He ran straight to the truck. The door was jammed. Without thinking twice, he pulled hard, the metal groaning under his grip. Sandra helped the woman move back while Keanu tried again. This time, the door opened. Inside, the man was conscious but trapped. Keanu reached in, carefully unbuckling the seatbelt. "It's okay, sir," he said gently. "We'll get you out." The engine sparked once, smoke thickening. People screamed for them to move away. Sandra shouted, "Keanu! It's too dangerous!" But he didn't step back. Not yet, he said firmly. He's still inside. He managed to pull the man out just as flames began licking the front of the truck. They stumbled backward, coughing, the woman rushing forward to hold her husband. Sandra grabbed Keanu's arm, her eyes wide. Are you okay? He nodded, breathless. Yeah, I'm fine. The crowd clapped softly, some people crying, others filming. But Keanu didn't look at the cameras. He only looked at the couple, the way they held each other tightly, alive. A paramedic arrived minutes later and took over. Sandra stood beside Keanu, her eyes still wet. You did it again, she whispered. He smiled faintly. I didn't do anything special. You did everything special, she said quietly. The paramedic approached them and said, Sir, you should get that hand checked. Looks like you burned it. Keanu looked down. His palm was red, blistered from pulling the hot metal door. He shrugged. Just a scratch. Sandra frowned. A scratch doesn't smoke, Keanu. She insisted on taking him to the small clinic nearby. He sat on a narrow bed while a nurse wrapped his hand in clean gauze. She looked at him kindly. You're lucky, she said. Another minute and you'd have been caught in that fire. He smiled softly. Luck's just another word for grace, I guess. After the nurse left, Sandra sat beside him. Her voice was soft but trembling slightly. You scare me, you know that? Why? Because you give everything, every time, without thinking. He looked at her gently. Isn't that what kindness is supposed to be? Maybe, she said. But what happens when it breaks you? He smiled faintly. Then someone like you reminds me how to heal. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the world stopped. Something unspoken passed between them. Something deeper than friendship. Something older than love. She reached for his bandaged hand. You can't keep saving everyone, she said softly. Maybe not, he replied. But I can keep trying. They left the clinic as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with orange and gold. People still whispered as they passed, some recognizing him, others just smiling with quiet gratitude. As they reached the car, Sandra turned to him. You know, there's a pattern here. What pattern? Every time you walk away, life finds a way to pull you back, to remind you who you are. He leaned against the car door, looking at her with a tired smile. And every time you're there to see it happen. Maybe that's my role, she said softly. To follow, to remind, to stay. He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes warm and full. Then maybe that's what keeps me human. They drove back to the cabin as night settled over the hills. The stars were brighter than ever, scattered like soft silver dust across the sky. Keanu rested his injured hand on the window frame, feeling the cool wind against it. You ever think, he said quietly, that maybe kindness isn't something we choose? Maybe it chooses us? Sandra smiled. Then I think it chose the right person. He turned to her, his voice almost a whisper. Or maybe it chose both of us. And for the first time since that night he walked away, Keanu didn't feel like someone trying to escape. He felt like someone finally walking home. The night he didn't walk away, the cabin was quiet again. Only the soft crackle of the fire filled the space. Sandra sat on the floor near the fireplace, her back against the couch, lost in thought. Keanu sat a few feet away, his injured hand resting in his lap, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. Outside, rain had started again. Gentle, steady, the kind that calms more than it frightens. It was almost poetic how the story had come full circle. Another quiet night, another rain-soaked silence. But this time, Keanu wasn't walking away. He broke the silence first. You know, he said softly, I used to think peace meant being alone. Silence, distance, no one around to ask questions, but now it feels different. Sandra looked up at him, her expression tender. Different how? It feels less like running, he said. More like arriving, she smiled faintly. You sound like a man who finally stopped searching. He laughed quietly, his voice tired but warm. Maybe I just realized that peace doesn't live in places and it lives in people. Her eyes softened. You really mean that? I do, he said. You showed me that. The night you followed me when you didn't say anything, that silence meant more than any words. She smiled, remembering. I just didn't want you to disappear. He looked at her, a long, thoughtful pause before he spoke again. You didn't just stop me from disappearing. You reminded me why I existed. Her breath caught, her chest tightening with quiet emotion. Keanu! He shook his head slightly. No, let me say this. I've spent years giving away pieces of myself to people, to strangers, to causes. I thought that was my purpose, to keep giving until there was nothing left. But now I see, kindness isn't about giving everything. It's about sharing what's real, and you're part of that truth. She didn't speak. Her eyes glistened in the firelight, and for once, even she didn't know how to answer. The rain outside grew stronger. Thunder rolled softly through the valley. But inside, the air was warm, heavy with honesty and something deeper neither of them wanted to name. After a while, she said quietly, You know, people see you as this symbol, the man who never breaks, who's always kind. They don't see the tired parts, the lonely parts. He smiled faintly. Maybe they don't have to. Maybe it's enough that you do. She reached out and touched his bandaged hand gently. You don't have to be strong all the time. His voice was soft. And you don't have to remind me anymore. For a moment, everything stopped. The fire crackled slower, the rain softened, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Their eyes met, and in that quiet space, everything they had left unsaid finally found meaning. Then Sandra said, You know what I've learned from you? He looked at her, curious. What? That kindness isn't loud. It's quiet, patient, and sometimes it hurts. But even when it hurts, it's still the right thing to do. He smiled softly. That sounds like something I'd say. Maybe, she said, but this time I mean it for you. The fire dimmed to glowing embers. Keanu leaned back, exhaling deeply, the kind of sigh that feels like release. So what now? She asked gently. He looked toward the window where rain streaked down the glass. Now I stay. No more walking away, no more hiding. I think it's time I stop searching for peace in quiet places and start creating it where I stand. She smiled. You always did belong here, in the world, with people, not away from them. He turned to her, his eyes steady and full. And maybe you always belonged right beside me. She didn't answer, but the warmth in her smile said enough. They sat together until the rain faded into soft mist. Dawn began to break, painting the world in pale gold. Keanu stood and opened the door. Cool air rushed in, fresh and clean. He stepped outside, barefoot, letting the wet earth touch his feet. He tilted his head back, eyes closed, feeling the world breathe with him. Sandra joined him quietly, standing just behind. You hear that? He asked. What? Nothing, he said softly. And somehow it doesn't feel empty anymore, she smiled. Because silence doesn't mean loneliness, Keanu. Sometimes it means peace. He turned slightly toward her. And sometimes it means gratitude. She tilted her head. For what? For the ones who follow without a word, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The sky grew brighter. The first ray of sun touched their faces, and in that golden light the weight of years seemed to lift, the pain, the exhaustion, the loneliness. All of it melted into something pure and quiet. For the first time in a long time, Keanu wasn't running. He wasn't searching. He was simply there, in the moment, beside someone who understood without needing to speak. And maybe that was the real story all along. Not about fame or pain or even kindness itself, but about finding someone who saw the same quiet light inside you and decided to stay. The world beyond the hills began to wake. Somewhere, people would talk about the man who had saved lives, helped strangers, and walked away from the noise, but they would never know this version. The man who finally stopped walking, who found peace in the stillness of his own heart. Sandra looked at him one last time that morning and said softly, So, what happens next? He smiled, eyes glinting with the calm of someone who finally understood. Next, he said, we live. And as the sun rose over the valley, Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock stood side by side. Two souls who had learned that even the quietest hearts can change the world, not by leaving it, but by staying in it with kindness.